They laughed when the cross appeared on the screen, but what stayed with me was not the laughter, it was the silence that followed. That silence told me that many people in that room had heard the insult, had understood its meaning, and had still chosen to lower their eyes. My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I speak to you not only as the president of Burkina Faso, but as a man who has seen war, poverty, fear, and prayer living side by side in the same villages. I have sat with mothers who buried their sons. I have spoken with soldiers who carried nothing but courage, a small Bible, and the hope that God had not abandoned their country. I have watched ordinary people kneel on dry ground and ask Jesus Christ for strength before facing another day of uncertainty. In December 2025, I traveled to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for a major international conference at the International Conference Center. It was planned to last 3 days. More than 40 African nations were represented. Delegates from the African Union were present. So were officials from international financial institutions and several Western delegations. On paper, the gathering was about development, security, cooperation, and the future of Africa. I had attended many international meetings before. I knew that disagreements were normal. Leaders do not always share the same vision. Nations do not always protect the same interests. Sometimes words become sharp, and sometimes negotiations become uncomfortable. That is politics. I understood that. But what happened in that room was different. It was not simply a disagreement over policy. It was not a debate about budgets, borders, debt, or trade. It touched something deeper. It touched faith. It touched human dignity. It touched the sacred values that millions of African families still carry in their hearts, even when they have little money, little security, and little comfort. For many years, I had watched powerful nations speak to Africa as if Africa were a child that needed correction. I had seen resources leave our soil while poverty remained in our homes. I had seen corrupt systems supported when they served foreign interests. I had heard people call this partnership, even when respect was missing. But when some officials began to mock Christianity, when they treated the cross as a symbol of backwardness, something inside me became still. I thought of my mother. I thought of the prayers of my people. I thought of the fallen soldiers who carried the cross close to their hearts. I did not come to create division. I came because silence, at the wrong moment, can become surrender. The meeting began like many other meetings I had attended before. There was order, ceremony, and a careful language that leaders use when every sentence may later be repeated by journalists, diplomats, and political opponents. The hall in Addis Ababa was large enough to hold more than 300 delegates. Flags stood behind the main platform. Translation headsets were placed neatly on the tables. Nameplates identified presidents, ministers, advisors, financial officers, security representatives, and observers from different organizations. Everyone looked prepared, everyone looked serious. At first, nothing seemed unusual. I entered the room knowing that the next 3 days would not be easy. Africa was facing difficult questions. Security was one of them, development was another. Debt, trade, food, energy, and migration were also waiting on the table like heavy stones. Every country had its own pain, every delegation had its own interest. Some came to ask for support, some came to offer advice, some came to protect influence that had been built over many years. I sat with the delegation of Burkina Faso and listened carefully. The first sessions were calm. Speakers talked about regional stability. They spoke about investment, youth unemployment, infrastructure, and the need for stronger cooperation between African states. Some words sounded hopeful, some sounded rehearsed. I had heard many of them before. Still, I listened because even repeated words can sometimes open the door to real action. Several African leaders spoke about the suffering of their people. They spoke about families displaced by violence. They spoke about farmers unable to reach their land. They spoke about schools that needed protection, roads that needed rebuilding, and young people who needed a future beyond fear. I understood those words deeply because they were not distant ideas to me. They were the reality of my own people. When representatives from international financial institutions spoke, the language became more technical. They mentioned development frameworks, regional programs, long-term financing, and institutional reform. Some delegates took notes. Others looked tired. There are moments in these conferences when suffering becomes a chart, hunger becomes a projection, and the pain of a village becomes a paragraph in a report. I did not reject discussion. I did not reject cooperation. No nation can solve every problem alone. But I had learned that cooperation without respect becomes another form of control. Help without humility can become a chain. Advice without understanding can become an insult. During the first hours, I remained quiet. I watched the room. I listened to the tone behind the words. I studied who spoke with sincerity and who spoke as if Africa were only a problem to be managed. Some Western delegates spoke with courtesy. Others spoke with the cold confidence of people who had never walked through the villages they claimed to understand. They spoke about African institutions, African culture, African leadership, and African youth as if our continent were a project waiting for foreign approval. Even then, I did not interrupt. I told myself that patience was necessary. I reminded myself that a leader must not react to every careless sentence. A nation is not defended by anger alone. A nation is defended by wisdom, discipline, and the ability to know when silence is strength and when silence becomes weakness. By midday, the atmosphere still appeared positive to many people in the room. Cameras captured polite handshakes, delegates exchanged documents, advisors whispered behind their leaders. The official program continued according to schedule. Anyone watching from outside would have believed that this was just another conference, another diplomatic gathering, another attempt to speak about Africa's future. But beneath that polished surface, I felt something changing. It was not yet visible, but it was present. The language was becoming sharper. Certain speakers were no longer speaking only about economic policy. They were beginning to speak about identity, belief, and the values that African societies should accept if they wanted to be considered modern. I looked around the hall and saw many African delegates listening carefully. Some had expressionless faces, some were uncomfortable but said nothing. They knew, as I knew, that there are moments when powerful people do not insult you directly. They wrap the insult in educated words. They place it inside a presentation. They call it progress. They call it modernization. They call it partnership. But the meaning remains clear. At that moment, I still hoped the meeting would return to practical matters. I hoped we would focus on security, roads, agriculture, schools, hospitals, and the dignity of our people. I hoped no one would cross the line between policy and contempt. But no one in that hall knew that only a few hours later, the meeting would take a direction that many people would regret. And when that moment came, I would no longer be able to remain seated. The moment came during an afternoon session that was supposed to focus on social development and institutional reform. The topic sounded harmless. It was the kind of phrase that appears often in international meetings, broad enough to include schools, health systems, youth programs, women's participation, and community stability. At first, I listened without concern. A Western official was given the floor. He spoke with confidence, as if he carried the final answer to every problem on the continent. His voice was calm, his words were polished. He spoke about modernization, openness, social transformation, and the need for African societies to leave behind what he called outdated structures. I had heard similar language before. Sometimes it is used sincerely, sometimes it is used to encourage education, better governance, and stronger institutions, but sometimes it hides contempt. Sometimes it means that Africa must abandon everything that makes Africa itself. Sometimes it means that our traditions, families, churches, communities, and spiritual convictions are treated as obstacles to a foreign vision of progress. Then the presentation changed. An image appeared on the large screen behind him. It showed symbols connected to faith, tradition, and African community life. Among them was the cross. It was not presented with respect. It was placed there as an example of what the speaker described as old thinking that slowed development. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. I looked again at the screen. I listened carefully to the tone of the speaker. He was not simply saying that governments must improve schools or fight corruption. He was not simply saying that religion should not be used to excuse injustice. Those would have been fair points, and I could have listened to them. Instead, he spoke as if faith itself were a weakness. He spoke as if the people who prayed before working, who carried the Bible in their homes, who trusted Jesus Christ in moments of hunger and fear, were people trapped in the past. Then I heard laughter. It did not come from everyone. I must be fair about that. Many people in the room did not laugh. Some looked away. Some kept their faces serious. Some African delegates lowered their heads, not because they agreed, but because they understood how dangerous that moment had become. But a few voices laughed loudly enough for the whole room to hear. That laughter moved through the hall like a cold wind. It was not ordinary laughter. It was not the laughter of friendship or misunderstanding. It was the laughter of people who believed they were standing above others. It was the laughter of those who thought the cross could be reduced to a symbol of ignorance. It was the laughter of those who did not understand that, for millions of people, the cross is not a decoration. It is hope, it is sacrifice, it is forgiveness. It is the memory of mothers praying at night when there was no medicine, no electricity, and no money. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not rage. Rage is often loud and careless. What I felt was heavier. It was grief mixed with clarity. I understood that this was no longer a normal disagreement about policy. This was no longer a discussion about development models. This had become a direct insult to the faith of millions of African Christians and many believers across the world. In that room were delegates from countries where churches had been burned, villages had been attacked, and families had buried loved ones while still singing hymns through tears. In that room were leaders who knew that faith was not a political slogan for poor people. Faith was the last shelter many families had when every earthly system failed them. I looked at the African delegates around me. Some of them were Christians, some were Muslims, some came from traditional spiritual backgrounds, but even those who did not share the Christian faith understood the principle. If one sacred belief could be mocked today, another could be mocked tomorrow. If the cross could be treated with contempt in a public conference, then what would stop the same contempt from reaching the mosque, the family, the elders, the dead, the poor, and every value that holds a society together? That was the danger. A civilization does not collapse only when its economy fails. It also collapses when it loses the ability to respect what is sacred to others. When powerful people laugh at the deepest convictions of ordinary people, they do not appear modern, they appear empty. I kept my hands still on the table. I did not speak yet. I wanted to be certain that I was not reacting too quickly. A leader must measure the moment before answering it. A careless response can damage the truth it tries to defend. But the more the speaker continued, the clearer it became. This was not a slip of the tongue, this was a worldview. It was the belief that Africa could only be accepted if Africa became ashamed of itself. It was the belief that faith must be hidden, softened, or mocked before a nation can be called developed. I could not accept that. I thought of the villages in Burkina Faso, where people still gathered to pray under difficult conditions. I thought of the elderly women who held rosaries with tired hands. I thought of the fathers who opened the Bible before leaving home because they did not know whether they would return safely. I thought of the soldiers who carried small crosses in their pockets, not because they believed metal could save them, but because they wanted a reminder that God saw them, even in the dust and danger. If no one spoke that day, the silence would send a message. It would say that faith could be insulted, as long as the insult came from a powerful nation. It would say that African leaders could discuss loans, borders, and security, but not defend the dignity of their own people. It would say that the cross could be mocked in front of us and we would simply adjust our jackets, lower our eyes, and wait for the next agenda item. I asked myself a question that stayed with me. If no one speaks today, what will they mock tomorrow? At that moment, I knew the meeting had crossed a line. I did not yet stand, I did not yet interrupt, but inside me, the decision was forming. I would not answer with hatred, I would not insult anyone's nation, I would not pretend that Africa had no faults of its own, but I would speak. I would speak because respect must be mutual, or cooperation is only another name for domination. And as the laughter faded, I understood that the next words I heard would decide whether I remained silent or rose from my seat. I did not stand immediately because of one image on a screen. I did not stand because my pride had been wounded. I stood because, in that moment, memories came back to me with a force stronger than any speech prepared by an advisor. I remembered my childhood. I remembered the simple prayers spoken in my home. They were not complicated prayers. They were not the words of rich people asking for more comfort. They were the prayers of people asking God for protection, food, wisdom, and mercy. My mother taught me that a man may lose many things in life, but he must not lose the fear of God. She did not say this to make me weak. She said it because she understood that a person without reverence can become dangerous, even when he is educated, powerful, and well-dressed. In our home, faith was not decoration. It was not something we used only during ceremonies. It was part of how we understood suffering. It helped us endure what we could not control. It reminded us that human power has limits, and that every leader, every soldier, every judge, every minister, and every president will one day answer for what he did with the authority placed in his hands. As I sat in that conference hall, surrounded by microphones, cameras, and polished speeches, I thought about those early lessons. I thought about how different that room was from the homes of ordinary people. In that room, people spoke about development with expensive words. In the villages, people spoke to God with empty hands. I remembered the people of Burkina Faso who still prayed while living under pressure that many foreign officials would never understand. I remembered mothers who asked for peace before asking for wealth. I remembered fathers who walked long distances to find work and still thanked God when they returned home alive. I remembered elderly Christians who had lost almost everything but still opened the Bible as if they were opening a window toward light. Those people were not backward. They were not obstacles to progress. They were human beings carrying dignity in difficult circumstances. I also remembered soldiers I had known. Some were young, some were older than me, some spoke very little about faith, but they carried it quietly. I had seen small crosses in pockets, prayer cards folded into uniforms, and Bibles worn from use. I had seen men who did not know whether they would survive the next operation still bow their heads before leaving. They were not using faith as a political slogan. They were using it as a final anchor when fear came close. Some of those soldiers never returned. When a man dies defending his homeland with a cross near his heart, no foreign official has the right to laugh at what that cross meant to him. When a mother receives the news that her son has fallen and still whispers the name of Jesus through her tears, no conference speaker has the right to call her faith a relic of the past. When a poor family kneels together because prayer is the only strength they have left, no educated person should turn that sacred act into a joke. That was what I felt in the silence before I stood. I was not thinking only about myself. I was thinking about people who would never enter that conference hall. I was thinking about farmers, widows, teachers, pastors, nurses, and soldiers. I was thinking about people whose names would never appear in official documents, but whose prayers kept entire communities from sinking into despair. And I asked myself what leadership means if it cannot defend them. A leader does not only defend borders, he must also defend the dignity of his people. He must defend the right of the poor to believe without being insulted. He must defend the sacred things that hold families together when politics fails. He must understand that the soul of a nation is not measured only by roads, airports, and financial reports. There was another thought that troubled me even more. What frightened me was not only the mockery itself, it was how normal it seemed to some people. A few laughed, yes, but others behaved as if nothing serious had happened. They shifted papers, adjusted their headsets, and waited for the presentation to continue. That calmness disturbed me. When insult becomes normal, conscience becomes weak. When sacred things are mocked and people remain comfortable, society begins to lose its protection against cruelty. Today the joke is about faith. Tomorrow it may be about the elderly, the poor, the unborn, the sick, the grieving, or anyone considered inconvenient by those who hold power. This is how disrespect grows. It does not always begin with violence. Sometimes it begins with laughter. Sometimes it begins with a sentence spoken in a conference room. Sometimes it begins when good people decide that peace is more important than truth. I looked again at the screen. The cross was still there, reduced to an example in someone else's argument. But in my heart, I saw something different. I saw my mother's faith. I saw the prayers of my people. I saw the graves of soldiers. I saw churches filled with ordinary believers who were not asking the world to praise them, only to respect them. At that moment, the decision became clear. If I remained silent, my silence would not be neutral. It would be understood as acceptance. It would tell every person watching that a leader can sit calmly while the faith of his people is mocked. It would tell the powerful that Africa's sacred values can be insulted as long as the language sounds modern enough. I could not allow that message to leave the room unchallenged. Still, I knew I had to speak with discipline. I did not want to answer contempt with contempt. I did not want to turn faith into a weapon. I did not want to embarrass innocent people who had not joined the laughter. I wanted to speak in a way that was firm, clear, and impossible to misunderstand. So I breathed slowly. I placed my hands on the table. I waited for the right second. The speaker continued, but I no longer heard only his words. I heard the voices of many people behind me, people who were not present in body but were present in my conscience. Their silence was asking me a question. Will you defend what we believe, or will you let them laugh at it? That question gave me the strength to stand. Because if the world continues to normalize the mocking of faith, then one day people will not even recognize when dignity has been taken from them. And if that day comes, what will remain of our humanity? I stood up before the speaker finished his prepared remarks. The sound in the room changed immediately. It was not loud, but it was clear. Papers stopped moving. Several heads turned. A few delegates removed their translation headsets and looked toward the table of Burkina Faso. Others leaned closer to their microphones, trying to understand whether I intended to ask a simple question or challenge the direction of the entire session. I did not raise my voice. I did not strike the table. I did not point my finger at anyone. Those things may create drama, but they do not always create truth. I had no desire to perform anger for the cameras. I wanted every person in that room to hear me, and I knew that sometimes the calmest voice can carry the heaviest message. I pressed the microphone button and asked for permission to speak. The chair of the session looked surprised. He glanced toward his notes, then toward the speaker, then back toward me. For a short moment, nobody answered. That hesitation told me that the room had already understood something serious was about to happen. Finally, he gave me the floor. I thanked him and said I would need only 5 minutes. In truth, I did not know whether 5 minutes would be enough. How can a man defend generations of faith in 5 minutes? How can a leader answer centuries of humiliation in 5 minutes? How can one voice carry the pain of mothers, soldiers, farmers, pastors, widows, and young people who have learned to survive by trusting God? But I did not need to say everything. I only needed to say what could not remain unsaid. I looked across the hall. I saw African delegates watching closely. I saw Western officials with careful faces. I saw advisors whispering to one another. I saw interpreters preparing to follow every word. I understood that whatever I said next would not disappear inside that room. It would travel. It would be repeated. Some would agree. Some would condemn. Some would twist the meaning. That is the risk of speaking publicly. Still, I knew that fear of misunderstanding must never become an excuse for silence. I began slowly. I said that I had come to the conference prepared to discuss security, development, economic cooperation, and the future of Africa. I said that Burkina Faso had no fear of debate and no fear of disagreement. I said that nations could challenge one another honestly without losing dignity. Then I paused. The room was still. I told them that what had just happened was not honest debate. It was not development policy. It was not intellectual courage. It was disrespect dressed in the language of progress. I could see the reaction immediately. Some faces tightened. Some people looked down. A few stared at me without blinking. No one interrupted. I continued. I said that the cross was not a toy for educated people to laugh at. It was not a symbol to be placed on a screen and treated as evidence of backwardness. For millions of Christians across Africa and around the world, the cross represented sacrifice, mercy, forgiveness, and hope. It represented Jesus Christ, who stood with the poor, touched the rejected, forgave sinners, and reminded the powerful that God sees what men try to hide. I told them that I was not speaking to force my faith on anyone. I was not asking every person in the room to become Christian. I was not denying the dignity of Muslims, traditional believers, or people who did not share my beliefs. Respect for faith must never become hatred toward another faith. But if we demand respect for all people, then we must also respect what is sacred to them. That was the first truth I wanted to make clear. The second truth was that Africa was not a continent without memory. We remembered what had been done to us. We remembered the ships, the forced labor, the stolen resources, the artificial borders, the supported dictators, the broken promises, and the systems that continued to remove wealth from our soil while leaving our children without enough opportunity. I did not say this to reopen wounds for the sake of anger. I said it because arrogance often grows where memory is denied, something that made the room even quieter. I said that no partnership can survive contempt, no investment can cover disrespect, no development program can replace dignity. If a nation comes to Africa with money in one hand and mockery in the other, then Africa must have the courage to refuse both. Those words were not planned, they came from the center of my conviction. As I spoke, I felt no hatred. That surprised even me. My voice remained steady because my purpose was not revenge. My purpose was correction. There is a difference. Revenge wants to wound. Correction wants truth to be heard before damage becomes permanent. I could feel the attention of the entire hall gathering around each sentence. I then said that I would speak about three matters. The first concerned the right of powerful nations to lecture Africa about morality while ignoring their own history. The second concerned the growing habit of imposing foreign values on African societies and then calling resistance ignorance. The third concerned Burkina Faso's decision about whether we could continue participating in a conference where sacred beliefs had been treated with contempt. When I said this, I saw several delegates sit up straighter. They understood that my words were moving beyond objection. They understood that I was preparing to make a decision, not merely express disappointment. The chair of the session looked tense. The Western official who had given the presentation no longer looked comfortable. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes earlier was gone completely. That silence did not frighten me. It confirmed that the truth had reached the room. I looked once more at the screen, then back at the delegates. I thought again of my mother. I thought of the people of Burkina Faso. I thought of the elderly believers in America, Africa, and many places across the world who still bow their heads and ask Jesus for mercy in a time when the world seems to mock everything sacred. Then I said the words that opened the door to everything that followed. There are three things I must condemn today, and I will speak them plainly. I began with the first thing I had to condemn, because it was the foundation beneath everything else. I told the room that no nation, no alliance, and no institution has the right to speak to Africa as if Africa has no memory. Respect cannot be demanded from a continent while its wounds are treated as footnotes. Partnership cannot be built on speeches that ignore the long shadow of history. I said that many Western nations often speak to Africa about morality, governance, human rights, and development. Sometimes those words are necessary. Africa must be honest about its own failures. We have known corruption. We have known betrayal by our own leaders. We have known violence, injustice, and systems that wounded our people from inside. I did not stand there to pretend that Africa was perfect. But I also said that honesty must be complete. If you want to teach morality, you must first be willing to remember your own record. You cannot speak as if history began only when Africa became independent. You cannot speak as if colonialism was a closed chapter with no living consequences. You cannot speak as if the extraction of resources, the drawing of artificial borders, and the support of convenient regimes left no scars behind. The room remained silent as the interpreters carried my words into different languages. I told them that many African nations were still carrying the weight of systems they did not design. Some of our borders were drawn without regard for our people. Some of our economies were shaped to export raw materials rather than build strong local industries. Some of our institutions were weakened before they had the chance to mature. Then, after generations of disruption, the same powers returned to ask why Africa was not moving fast enough. That is not morality. That is selective memory. I spoke of resources leaving African soil. Gold, uranium, oil, minerals, timber, and other forms of wealth have moved across oceans, while too many African children still sit in classrooms without enough books, while hospitals lack equipment, while mothers walk long distances for basic care, while young people risk their lives seeking opportunities elsewhere. The world knows that Africa is rich beneath the ground. The tragedy is that many African people remain poor above it. I did not say this to accuse every person from the West. I made that clear. There are sincere people in Europe, in America, and in other parts of the world who care deeply about justice. There are churches, families, doctors, teachers, missionaries, and ordinary citizens who have served Africa with humility. I respect them. I honor every person who comes to Africa with love, not arrogance. But governments and institutions must be judged by their actions, not by their slogans. I told the delegates that when powerful nations speak of morality, they must understand how their words sound to people who have lived under the consequences of foreign interference. When they speak about human dignity, they must remember the dignity that was denied to Africans for generations. When they speak about reform, they must remember the systems they helped build or protect because those systems served their interests. Then I returned to the insult that had brought me to my feet. I said that mocking the cross inside such a historical context was not a small mistake. It carried a deeper meaning. It suggested that not only Africa's resources, politics, and economies were open to foreign judgment, but also Africa's soul. It suggested that even our faith must be approved by those who believe themselves more advanced. That, I said, is unacceptable. I reminded them that faith has carried many African communities through suffering that no development report can fully explain. When war came, people prayed. When famine threatened, people prayed. When families lost loved ones, people prayed. When leaders failed them, people prayed. The cross did not make them passive. It helped them endure. It gave them courage to forgive without becoming weak, to hope without becoming blind, and to continue living when despair seemed easier. To laugh at that is not progress. It is cruelty wearing a modern suit. I could see some delegates nodding slowly. They did not need to share every detail of my faith to understand the truth of what I was saying. A person does not need to be Christian to know that the sacred beliefs of millions should not be treated as an object of public mockery. I then said that respect must come before cooperation. This was important. I did not say that money must come before cooperation. I did not say that military support, trade agreements, or diplomatic recognition must come before cooperation. I said respect. Without respect, every agreement is fragile. Without respect, every handshake hides suspicion. Without respect, the language of partnership becomes a mask for domination. I told the Western delegates that they should not confuse economic strength with moral authority. A wealthy nation is not automatically a righteous nation. A powerful nation is not automatically a wise nation. A country may have tall buildings, strong banks, advanced weapons, and famous universities, and still lose the humility that protects the human soul. That sentence seemed to weigh heavily in the room. I continued because I knew this first point had to be understood clearly. I said that insulting faith is not a sign of intelligence. It is not courage. It is not enlightenment. Real intelligence listens before it judges. Real courage respects those who are different. Real progress does not require a people to become ashamed of their prayers, their families, their elders, or their belief in God. Then I spoke more personally. I told them that if they traveled through Burkina Faso, they would meet people who had very little but still carried great dignity. They would meet mothers who prayed for peace. They would meet fathers who worked hard without knowing if tomorrow would be easier. They would meet soldiers who faced danger with faith in their hearts. They would meet pastors who comforted broken families, and believers who shared food even when they had little. Are these the people you call backward? Are these the people whose faith you laugh at? I did not ask the questions loudly. I asked them slowly, because I wanted them to enter the conscience of the room. No one answered. That silence was enough. I ended the first condemnation by saying that Africa is willing to talk to the world, but Africa will not kneel before contempt. We can discuss reforms, we can discuss security, we can discuss economic models, we can discuss our failures and our hopes. But no one should mistake our willingness to listen for permission to insult what our people hold sacred. The room was still. I knew the first truth had been spoken. But that was only the beginning. The second thing I condemned was the habit of treating African identity as something that must be corrected before Africa can be respected. I told the room that a nation is not only its economy, a nation is also its memory, its families, its elders, its prayers, its language, its way of mourning, its way of celebrating, and its way of teaching children what is right and wrong. If you enter a nation and attack those things, you are not helping that nation develop. You are asking that nation to disappear slowly while still keeping its flag. I said that Africa has the right to grow without being forced to hate itself. We have the right to build roads without abandoning reverence. We have the right to create industries without mocking our ancestors. We have the right to educate our children without teaching them that faith is shameful. We have the right to improve governance without accepting the idea that every foreign value is superior to every African value. This was not a rejection of learning from the world. I made that clear. Africa must learn. Every nation must learn. Burkina Faso must learn. We must learn better ways to govern, better ways to protect public money, better ways to feed our people, better ways to educate our youth, and better ways to build peace. Pride must never become blindness. Tradition must never become an excuse for injustice. Faith must never become a cover for cruelty. But learning is different from surrender. There is a way to learn from others while still remaining yourself. There is a way to welcome knowledge without becoming ashamed of your own people. There is a way to accept useful advice without allowing another civilization to sit above your soul like a judge. I looked toward the officials who had spoken about modernization. I told them that modernization cannot mean spiritual humiliation. Progress cannot mean that African children must be trained to laugh at the same prayers that carried their grandparents through hardship. Development cannot mean that the cross must be removed from the heart of a believer so that a foreign report can call him enlightened. That kind of progress is not progress at all. It is emptiness with expensive language. I reminded them that Christianity in Africa is not a weak or imported decoration sitting on the surface of society. For millions of people, faith in Jesus Christ has become part of daily life. It shapes how families forgive. It shapes how communities bury their dead. It shapes how people endure poverty without surrendering to despair. It shapes how the elderly pray for children who have left home. It shapes how the wounded try to rise again after loss. When you mock that, you are not mocking an idea on paper, you are mocking living people. You are mocking the grandmother who cannot read every line of a policy document but knows how to kneel and pray for her family. You are mocking the farmer who asks God for rain before planting because he knows his labor depends on mercy. You are mocking the nurse who whispers the name of Jesus after losing a patient. You are mocking the prisoner who finds repentance after years of darkness. You are mocking the soldier who asks God to forgive him before he steps into danger. I told the room that no civilization becomes great by laughing at the tears of the poor. That sentence came from a place deeper than politics. I was not speaking as a man trying to win applause. I was speaking as a son of Africa who had seen how much pain ordinary people carry quietly. The people who suffer most are often the people who still believe most sincerely. They do not have the luxury of mocking hope. Hope is sometimes all they have. Then I asked a question that I wanted every delegate to carry with them. If a civilization no longer respects the faith of others, where is that civilization going? I did not answer immediately. I allowed the question to remain in the room. Sometimes a question is stronger when silence stands beside it. After a moment, I continued. I said that a civilization may have technology, wealth, universities, media, armies, and influence. It may speak many languages of power. It may build systems that reach across the world. But if it loses the ability to respect what is sacred to others, it begins to lose its own soul. It may still look strong from the outside, but inside something has already begun to rot. That is how arrogance works. It does not always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it appears as laughter. Sometimes it appears as advice. Sometimes it appears as a policy condition. Sometimes it appears as the assumption that one culture has the right to reshape another culture without first listening to the people who live inside it. I told them that Africa does not need to be isolated from the world. Africa needs honest partnership. Africa needs trade that is fair. Africa needs security cooperation that does not become control. Africa needs investment that builds local strength instead of permanent dependence. Africa needs technology, education, roads, hospitals, and opportunity. But Africa also needs respect. Without respect, even good projects become poisoned. Without respect, aid becomes humiliation. Without respect, dialogue becomes performance. Without respect, every promise sounds like another trap. I then spoke about the danger of calling every African objection ignorance. I had seen this many times. When African leaders defend sovereignty, some call them extreme. When African families defend faith, some call them backward. When African communities protect moral values, some call them uneducated. When African nations refuse to be treated like silent recipients of orders, some call them unstable. This language is not innocent. It is a method of control. If you can make a people ashamed of their beliefs, you can make them easier to govern from outside. If you can convince young people that their elders are foolish, you can separate them from memory. If you can teach a nation to laugh at its own sacred values, you can leave that nation rich in resources but poor in spirit. I told the room that Burkina Faso would never accept that path. We may be poor in some material ways, but poverty does not give anyone the right to own our conscience. We may face insecurity, but insecurity does not give anyone the right to insult our faith. We may need partners, but need does not make us slaves. We may ask for cooperation, but cooperation must never require us to trade dignity for approval. Those words were difficult for some people to hear. I could see it on their faces. Some were uncomfortable because they knew the criticism was true. Others were offended because they were not used to hearing African leaders speak so plainly. A few looked at me as if I had broken the rules of diplomacy, but I had not broken diplomacy. I had only refused to confuse politeness with surrender. I said that faith is not the enemy of development. Corruption is, greed is, bad leadership is, violence is, exploitation is, ignorance is, the refusal to educate girls and boys is, the theft of public money is, the manipulation of ethnic divisions is, the selling of a nation's future for personal comfort is, but faith itself is not the enemy. A man who truly fears God should be more honest, not less. A leader who truly believes he will answer before God should steal less, not more. A society that truly honors Jesus Christ should protect the weak, forgive the repentant, welcome the broken, and resist cruelty. If people misuse religion, condemn the misuse. But do not mock the cross itself. That distinction mattered. I told them that Christianity has been misused by some, including by powerful people. I did not deny that. There have been those who carried the Bible in one hand and oppression in the other. There have been those who spoke the name of God while serving greed. There have been those who used religion to divide and control. But the failure of hypocrites does not cancel the truth of Christ. The betrayal of some believers does not give the world permission to mock sincere faith. Jesus Christ cannot be judged by the sins of those who claim his name while rejecting his ways. When I said that, I saw several African delegates nod more openly. I also saw some Western observers listening with a different expression. Not everyone in that room was hostile. Some were hearing the pain behind my words. Some understood that I was not attacking their people. I was warning against a spirit of contempt that could destroy any real partnership. I softened my tone, but I did not soften the message. I said that Africa is not asking the world to kneel before our beliefs. We are asking the world to stop stepping on them. We are not asking every leader to pray like we pray. We are asking every leader to understand that faith is not a toy for public ridicule. We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for the same respect that every people deserves. Then I returned to the image of the cross on the screen. I said that whoever placed it there as an example of backwardness had misunderstood the heart of many African nations. The cross does not make us less capable of building. It reminds us to build with conscience. The cross does not make us less modern. It reminds us that modern life without mercy becomes dangerous. The cross does not weaken our people. It has strengthened millions when politics, money, and human promises failed them. I paused again. The silence was now heavier than before. I knew the second truth had reached the room, but there was still one matter left, and I knew it would be the most difficult. It was one thing to condemn disrespect. It was another thing to decide what Burkina Faso would do about it. The third matter was the one that changed the entire conference. Until that point, some people may have believed I was only making a moral objection. They may have thought I would speak firmly, condemn the disrespect, and then return to my seat so the program could continue. That is often how international meetings survive uncomfortable moments. Someone speaks, someone apologizes without truly repenting, the schedule moves forward, the cameras record another handshake, the wound is covered but not healed. I knew that if I did only that, the message would be weak. Words matter, but sometimes words must be followed by a decision. If a leader condemns disrespect and then continues as if nothing happened, those who caused the harm may conclude that his anger had no cost. They may say, he spoke for his audience, but he still stayed. They may say, he objected, but he accepted the room. They may say, he defended faith with his mouth, but not with his feet. I could not allow that. So I looked toward the chair of the session, then toward the Western official whose presentation had brought us to that moment. I kept my voice calm because I wanted no one to confuse my decision with a loss of control. I wanted them to understand that this was not emotion exploding. This was conviction taking form. I said that Burkina Faso had come to Addis Ababa, ready to participate in a serious discussion about Africa's future. We had not come to beg, we had not come to insult anyone. We had come to speak as a sovereign nation with difficult problems, strong convictions, and a people who deserved respect. Then I said that no delegation from Burkina Faso could continue sitting in a conference where the sacred faith of millions had been mocked and treated as a barrier to progress. The room became completely still. I could hear the interpreter's voice through distant headsets as my words traveled into other languages. I could see people waiting to hear whether I meant a temporary protest or something more serious. So I made it clear. I announced that Burkina Faso would withdraw from the remaining program of the conference. Our delegation would not participate in the rest of the 3 days. We would leave the room immediately, not to create disorder, but to make a statement that respect is not optional. For a moment, nobody moved. It was the kind of silence that makes people aware of their own breathing. Some delegates looked at one another as if they were asking whether they had heard correctly. A few advisors leaned toward their leaders and whispered quickly. The chair of the session stared down at his papers, then back at me. The Western official who had spoken earlier no longer had the expression of a man in control of the room. I continued because I did not want the decision to be misunderstood. I said that Burkina Faso was not withdrawing from dialogue with the world. We were not closing our doors to sincere partners. We were not rejecting cooperation with people of goodwill from Europe, America, or any other region. We were withdrawing from a specific conference environment where contempt had entered the room and had not been corrected with the seriousness it deserved. I said that if anyone wished to work with Burkina Faso, they must come with respect. They must understand that our poverty does not erase our dignity, our security challenges do not cancel our sovereignty. Our need for development does not give anyone the right to laugh at our faith. Then I spoke directly to the larger principle. I said that when the cross is mocked, I do not hear only an insult against Christians. I hear a warning about the spirit of the age. I hear a warning that the powerful may one day believe nothing is sacred unless they control it. I hear a warning that the beliefs of ordinary people may be tolerated only when they remain silent, private, and harmless to the ambitions of those above them. That is not freedom. That is managed contempt. I told the room that many people across Africa and America, especially older believers who had lived through hardship, understood the cost of faith. They had buried spouses. They had survived wars. They had watched their children struggle. They had prayed in hospitals, in fields, in prisons, in small churches, and in lonely rooms. For them, the cross was not politics. It was the sign that suffering did not have the final word. To mock that before the world was not courage. It was a failure of the heart. I could see that some people were uncomfortable, but I also saw something else. I saw relief on a few African faces. Not joy, not excitement, but relief. It was the look of people who had been waiting for someone to say what they had felt but could not speak aloud. That look strengthened me. I turned slightly toward my own delegation. They understood. No long discussion was needed. They gathered their documents with quiet discipline. No one rushed, no one shouted, no one made a scene. We did not want chaos, we wanted clarity. Before leaving the microphone, I said one final thing. I said that the world must learn a simple lesson before it is too late. You cannot build the future by humiliating the souls of the people you claim to help. You cannot speak about development while laughing at the prayers that keep families alive. You cannot ask Africa to trust you while treating Africa's deepest convictions as material for ridicule. Then I stepped back from the microphone. The hall remained silent. No applause came at first. No immediate response came from the chair. No official statement softened the moment. It was as if the conference itself had stopped breathing. I began to walk out with the delegation of Burkina Faso. Every step felt heavy, but not because I doubted the decision. It felt heavy because I understood the cost. Some would call us dramatic, some would call us difficult, some would say we had damaged diplomacy, some would say we had allowed faith to interfere with development. But I believe the opposite. I believe that development without dignity is only decoration. I believe that diplomacy without respect is only theater. I believe that faith, when it is sincere, does not weaken public life. It reminds public life that human beings are more than markets, votes, labor, and statistics. As we moved toward the exit, I did not look back immediately. I wanted the room to sit with what had happened. I wanted them to understand that Burkina Faso had not stormed out in anger. We had walked out in conviction. There is a difference. Anger wants to burn the bridge. Conviction says the bridge must be rebuilt on stronger ground. When I reached the door, I paused for only a brief moment. I thought of the people back home who might never know every detail of that room, but who would understand the meaning of the decision. I thought of mothers praying for their sons. I thought of soldiers holding faith close to their hearts. I thought of Christians across Africa and America who had watched the world grow colder towards sacred things and wondered whether anyone in power still had the courage to speak. I wanted them to know they were not forgotten. I wanted them to know that their faith was not an embarrassment. I wanted them to know that the cross still had defenders, not because it needed political protection, but because people deserved to believe without being publicly humiliated. As the doors opened, I heard movement behind me. At first, I thought it was only my own delegation. Then I noticed that other chairs were shifting, other voices were rising softly, other leaders were speaking to their advisors. Something was happening in the room, something I had not expected. My decision had not ended the moment. It had only begun something larger. As I reached the doorway, I heard another chair move behind me, then another. At first, I did not turn around. I did not want my decision to appear as an invitation for theater. I had not stood to create a scene. I had not withdrawn so that others would follow me for appearance. I had acted for Burkina Faso, for the dignity of my people, and for the faith that had been mocked in that room. But the sound continued. Chairs moved, papers were gathered, quiet voices began crossing the hall. The careful order of the conference started to break, not into chaos, but into something more serious. It was the sound of conscience becoming movement. One of my advisors leaned toward me and whispered that the delegation from Mali was standing. I stopped. Then he said that Niger was also preparing to leave. Only then did I turn slightly and look back into the hall. I saw faces that had been silent only moments earlier now carrying decision. Some delegates were speaking to one another with urgency. Some looked toward the chair of the session. Others looked toward the screen where the image of the cross had appeared only a short time before. The atmosphere had changed completely. Before that moment, the room had belonged to the official agenda. It belonged to prepared speeches, technical reports, and diplomatic language. Now the room belonged to something no agenda could control. It belonged to the question of respect. It belonged to the question of whether Africa would continue sitting quietly whenever its deepest values were treated as something small. The representative from Mali stood with a serious face. He did not shout. He did not make a long speech. He simply said that his delegation could not continue, as if nothing had happened. His words were measured, but the meaning was strong. Then the representatives with him began collecting their materials. A few seconds later, the delegation from Niger also stood. Their decision moved through the room like a second wave. I saw the chair of the session trying to regain control. He adjusted his microphone and asked for calm. He said that misunderstandings could be addressed through proper channels. He spoke about maintaining the spirit of cooperation. He reminded everyone that the conference had important work ahead. But by then, the problem was no longer about procedure. The problem was trust. When trust is broken, a microphone cannot repair it. A schedule cannot repair it. A polite phrase cannot repair it. People may remain seated out of discipline, but their hearts have already left the room. That was what many people did not understand. The walkout did not create the wound, it revealed it. More delegates began to move. Not every African country left. I will not pretend that every person agreed with us. Some remained seated. Some were uncertain. Some may have believed that staying would allow them to negotiate better results. Some may have feared consequences. I understood that every nation carries its own pressures, and every leader must answer to his own people. But enough delegations stood that the conference could no longer continue normally. Empty seats began appearing across the hall. They were not only empty chairs, they were signs. They showed that something had shifted beneath the surface of African diplomacy. They showed that many nations were tired of being spoken to with polished disrespect. They showed that the old assumption was weakening, the assumption that Africa would accept humiliation because it needed assistance. As Burkina Faso's delegation moved out, others followed at different distances. Some walked with us directly, some left after speaking briefly to their teams. Some remained in the hall but refused to continue participating in the session until an explanation was given. The program broke apart. The next speaker did not begin on time. Advisors gathered around the front table. Organizers moved quickly from one side of the hall to the other. The translation booths remained active, but there was little left to translate. The official rhythm of the conference had been interrupted by something more powerful than procedure. Outside the hall, the corridors filled with quiet conversations. No one needed to shout. The silence was stronger than shouting. Some African delegates approached me and simply nodded. Others took my hand and said that what had happened inside had gone too far. A few told me that they had wanted to speak, but they had hesitated because they knew the pressure that would follow. I understood them. Not every person who remains silent is a coward. Sometimes people are calculating risks for their nation. Sometimes they are trapped between conviction and consequence. Sometimes they have been trained for years to believe that speaking too directly will cost their country funding, support, or diplomatic space. But there comes a moment when the cost of silence becomes higher than the cost of speech. That was the moment we had reached. As we stood in the corridor, I thought about how quickly the situation had changed. Only a few hours earlier, the The conference had looked stable. The agenda was printed. The names were arranged. The speeches were prepared. The cameras were ready. Everything seemed controlled. But control is fragile when respect is missing. This is something powerful institutions often forget. They believe that because they control budgets, platforms, reports, and invitations, they also control the hearts of people. They believe that because they can shape the language of meetings, they can shape the limits of dignity. They believe that if they call contempt modernization, the insult will become acceptable. But the human soul does not work that way. A people can be patient for many years. They can forgive many offenses. They can sit through many lectures. They can accept many difficult conversations. But when they feel that their faith, their dead, their mothers, their soldiers, and their sacred memories are being mocked, patience can turn into refusal. That refusal is not hatred. It is the last defense of dignity. Soon, word of the walkout began spreading beyond the conference center. Phones were moving, messages were being sent, journalists were trying to understand what had happened. Some would reduce the story to politics, some would say it was a diplomatic incident, some would argue that the reaction was too strong, others would understand that the issue was not only one presentation or one careless image. The issue was the widening distance between those who still believe respect is sacred and those who believe power gives them permission to define everything. I knew that criticism would come. There would be people who would say that Africa needed investment more than pride. They would say that we should have stayed and negotiated. They would say that faith should remain private. They would say that leaders should not allow religious emotion to affect diplomatic decisions. But I would ask them one question. If faith must remain private, why was it mocked publicly? That was the contradiction. We had not brought the cross into the meeting as a weapon. We had not demanded that the conference become a church service. We had not asked anyone to pray with us. The cross had been brought onto the screen by those who wanted to treat it as a symbol of backwardness. They made faith part of the discussion and then expected believers to remain silent when faith was insulted. That expectation was unreasonable. As more delegations left or suspended participation, the organizers were forced to adjust the program. Sessions were delayed. Private consultations began. Statements were drafted carefully. Words like misunderstanding, sensitivity, dialogue, and mutual respect began to appear in conversations that should have used them from the beginning. But the deeper warning could not be hidden. Trust between Africa and many powerful partners was weakening faster than some people wanted to admit. This was not caused by one moment in Addis Ababa. That moment only exposed what had been growing for years. Many Africans had become tired of relationships where resources moved outward, lectures moved inward, and respect arrived last, if it arrived at all. I stood outside that hall and felt no victory. I did not rejoice in disruption. A broken meeting does not feed a child. An interrupted conference does not rebuild a road. A public disagreement does not heal a wounded soldier. I knew that. I am not a man who believes symbols alone can solve material suffering. But symbols matter because they reveal what kind of future we are building. If Africa accepts partnership without dignity, then development will become another chain. If Africa accepts money in exchange for silence, then our children will inherit roads but lose courage. If Africa allows faith to be mocked in the name of progress, then one day progress itself will become empty. That is why the chain reaction mattered. It showed that Burkina Faso was not alone in feeling the weight of disrespect. It showed that other nations had also carried quiet frustration. It showed that many leaders understood, even if they had not yet said it publicly, that a new relationship with the world must be built on truth, not fear. As I left the conference center later that day, I looked once more at the building behind me. It was large, modern, and impressive. But I thought about the small churches and villages, the prayer rooms and homes, the quiet believers in America and Africa, and the elderly people who still bow their heads before meals because they know every day is mercy. Those places did not have the power of that conference hall, but they had something the hall had lost. They had reverence. And without reverence, power becomes dangerous. That day, the world received a warning. It was not a threat. It was not a declaration of hatred. It was a warning that respect cannot be treated as decoration. It must be the foundation. The question now was whether the West would understand that warning before more nations decided they had been silent long enough. After the walkout, many people wanted to speak about the incident as if it were only a diplomatic problem. They wanted to discuss who had left the room, who had stayed, who had made the strongest statement, and who had calculated the political cost. They wanted to know whether the conference would continue, whether statements would be issued, whether relations would become tense, and whether international partners would respond with anger or caution. But to me, the deepest issue was not protocol. The deepest issue was the lesson. I wanted the West to understand that economic strength does not give any nation the right to insult the soul of another people. A country may have powerful banks, advanced technology, large armies, famous universities, and influence in many international institutions. But none of that gives it permission to laugh at the faith of a mother who prays for her children. None of that gives it permission to treat the cross as a symbol of ignorance. None of that gives it permission to speak to Africa as if dignity were something poor nations must earn from rich nations. Dignity is not a loan. It is not a grant. It is not a development package. Dignity is given by God, and no political system has the authority to take it away. That was the first lesson I wanted them to hear. Do not confuse economic power with moral superiority. Wealth can build roads, but it cannot purify arrogance. Technology can connect continents, but it cannot replace humility. Military strength can control territory for a season, but it cannot command the respect of people whose hearts have been wounded. Respect must come before cooperation. If you come to Africa to trade, come with respect. If you come to invest, come with respect. If you come to discuss security, come with respect. If you come to advise, come with respect. If you come to disagree, still come with respect. Respect does not mean silence. It does not mean flattery. It does not mean pretending that Africa has no failures. True respect allows honest criticism. It allows difficult conversations. It allows partners to say hard truths to each other without contempt. But when criticism becomes mockery, when advice becomes humiliation, and when partnership becomes a mask for control, then the relationship is already poisoned. The second lesson was even more important. Anyone who wants to work with Africa must understand that Africa is not empty land waiting to be rewritten. Africa has a soul. Africa has memory. Africa has elders, graves, churches, mosques, families, languages, songs, prayers, and stories older than many modern institutions. We are not a blank page for powerful nations to fill with their own image. We are peoples created by God, carrying our own wounds and our own wisdom. The faith of Africa is not perfect because human beings are not perfect. There are hypocrites in churches. There are corrupt men who speak the name of God while serving greed. There are people who use religion to control others. I will never deny that. A lie does not become holy because it wears religious clothing. But the abuse of faith does not make faith itself worthless. The hypocrisy of some believers does not erase the sincerity of millions. The failures of men do not cancel the mercy of Jesus Christ. This is why I cannot accept the argument that Christianity must be mocked in order for society to move forward. If someone wants to condemn corruption, I will listen. If someone wants to condemn religious manipulation, I will listen. If someone wants to say that leaders must not hide behind faith while stealing from the poor, I will agree. But if someone says the cross itself is backward, if someone laughs at believers as if prayer were a disease, then I must answer. Faith is not the enemy of Africa's future. Greed is the enemy. Corruption is the enemy. Violence is the enemy. Foreign exploitation is the enemy. Bad leadership is the enemy. The loss of conscience is the enemy. A man who truly follows Jesus should not become less useful to his country. He should become more honest, more merciful, more disciplined, and more willing to serve. A leader who truly fears God should not steal from the poor. A judge who truly fears God should not sell justice. A soldier who truly fears God should protect the innocent. A rich man who truly fears God should not crush the weak for profit. That is not backwardness. That is the foundation of a moral society. The third lesson was a warning from history. Arrogance has destroyed many empires. It often begins quietly. A powerful nation starts to believe that its wealth proves its wisdom. It starts to believe that other cultures must be corrected, not understood. It starts to believe that the pain of smaller nations is only a detail. It starts to believe that it can take resources, shape governments, mock traditions, and still be loved by the people it wounded. But no empire remains strong forever when it loses humility. History is full of nations that looked invincible before they fell. They had armies, they had money, they had influence, they had loyal servants in many places. Yet they forgot that power without righteousness becomes unstable. They forgot that people may obey for a time while resentment grows beneath the surface. They forgot that the human heart can endure pressure for many years but not forever. What happened in Addis Ababa was not the end of cooperation between Africa and the West. I do not want that. I do not want isolation. I do not want hatred. I do not want young Africans to inherit a world divided by bitterness. I want honest relationships. I want fair trade. I want schools, hospitals, farms, roads, security, and opportunity. I want our children to learn science, build industries, and participate in the modern world without being told to despise the faith of their fathers and mothers. Africa does not need to choose between development and dignity. Africa must have both. We can build without surrendering our conscience. We can trade without selling our soul. We can welcome technology without mocking prayer. We can educate our children without teaching them contempt for the elderly. We can cooperate with the world without allowing the world to decide what is sacred for us. That is the future I want. I also want older believers in America, Africa, and across the world to hear this clearly. Many of you have lived long enough to see values change. You have watched societies become faster, louder, and colder. You have watched people laugh at things that once held families together. You have watched faith pushed aside, not always by law, but by ridicule. You have wondered whether your prayers still matter in a world that seems proud of forgetting God. I want to tell you that your prayers matter. Your quiet faith matters. Your Bible on the table matters. Your forgiveness matters. Your love for your children matters. Your refusal to hate matters. Your belief in Jesus Christ is not weakness, even if the world calls it old. There are people in power who still understand that a nation without reverence becomes dangerous. There are people who still believe that mercy is stronger than pride. There are people who still believe that the cross is not a symbol of defeat, but a reminder that God can bring life even after suffering. That day, I did not defend only myself. I did not defend only Burkina Faso. I did not defend only Africa. I defended the right of ordinary people to believe without being mocked by those who think money makes them superior. I defended the dignity of mothers who pray. I defended the memory of soldiers who died with faith in their hearts. I defended the poor who still lift their eyes to heaven when every human promise fails. Some will misunderstand this message. Some will say it is politics. Some will say it is emotion. Some will say faith should remain hidden. But I believe faith that brings compassion, honesty, courage, and humility should never be treated as shameful. The world does not need more contempt. The world needs repentance. The world needs leaders who remember that they are mortal. It needs institutions that serve people rather than using them. It needs powerful nations that know how to listen. It needs African nations that refuse corruption in their own houses while also refusing humiliation from outside. It needs Christians who live the gospel, not only speak it. It needs believers who defend truth without hatred and show courage without cruelty. That is the core of my message. Respect what is sacred. Defend human dignity. Do not sell your conscience for approval. Do not let laughter from powerful people make you ashamed of your faith. If the people with the most influence continue to mock the things that hold humanity together, then more nations will eventually decide that silence is no longer peace, it is surrender. And when that day comes, the world will discover that the poor, the wounded, the faithful, and the forgotten are not as powerless as they appear. So I leave this question with every person listening. If those in power continue to ridicule the most sacred things in human life, what will happen when more nations stand up and refuse to remain silent? And are we truly ready for that world? After all of this, I understood one truth more deeply than before. Power cannot save the human soul. Money cannot heal a heart that has forgotten mercy. Influence cannot protect a nation that has lost honesty, compassion, and faith. The world today has already seen too much suffering. We have seen wars destroy homes. We have seen hatred divide families. We have seen greed make rich men richer while poor people carry heavier burdens. We have seen leaders speak about peace while preparing conflict. We have seen people mock what is sacred and call it wisdom. But I still believe hope has not disappeared. I pray that good things will come to Burkina Faso. I pray that peace will come to Africa. I pray for the people of America, for the elderly who feel forgotten, for the families under pressure, and for every person in the world who is still trying to walk a righteous path. Let us turn away from evil. Let us reject greed and hatred. Let us return to what is good. Let us love one another, forgive one another, and help one another while we still have time. Even in the hardest season, do not lose hope. Light still exists for those who keep faith alive in their hearts. May God be with us, with Burkina Faso, with Africa, with America, and with the whole world. And if you also believe that goodness can still rise, leave a prayer from your heart and continue walking with us so this hope can reach many more people.